Hello everyone and welcome to Presence.tv. I'm Doug King and I'm going to be your host for this series on integral theology. And specifically what we're going to be talking about is integral theology and spiral dynamics. A lot of you may not be familiar with spiral dynamics and you may even be wondering, what does spiral dynamics have to do with the biblical narrative? Well, what we'll do in the beginning with this first session is go through briefly spiral dynamics, what its purpose is, how it's used, and then how we will be studying it in light of the biblical narrative. Spiral dynamics basically is about the growth or the evolution of human thinking since the beginning of time. And it is an accepted field of study in the world of academia in order to study cultures and the way they've developed, and therefore to be able to communicate between the various cultures that are on the planet today. So, spiral dynamics can be a secular-only subject, meaning that we could study spiral dynamics as people do without any mention of God whatsoever. You could be a student of spiral dynamics and be a philosophy major and not have any belief in God at all. What makes it exciting to us is that it overlays and mirrors beautifully the biblical narrative. And we'll obviously see that in this particular series that we're doing. The difference is that when we use spiral dynamics, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the development of spiritual consciousness, while the spiral is really looking at the consciousness, thinking, and viewpoints of cultures in a generic way. We will be looking specifically at how God, through the biblical narrative, developed the spiritual consciousness of humanity. Spiritual consciousness, by the way, has become a very hot topic of late. And the reason for that is because of the development of spiral dynamics into the realm of what they will call integral consciousness. Integral consciousness is new to the planet. This particular phase has not even been recognized by people in the academic field of dynamics until really the last decade or so. And when you get into, and as we'll see this in our study, when you get into integral consciousness, you're getting into particular aspects that are very inclusive by nature. So you might have attributes within integral consciousness that have to do with kindness or empathy or self-sacrifice. And when you get into these particular kinds of concepts, you are beginning to leave the world of the secular and really touch, really converge and meet with the biblical story of love. So we are now moving into the way that spiral dynamics meets, if you will, the biblical narrative and its story of love. This convergence of the study of philosophy or science with the study of spiritual consciousness is relatively new to the scene. And in fact, if we went back in history about 500 years, we would see that the split that occurred between science and religion started with Galileo and Copernicus, and that this split caused a rift between religion and science that very much exists to this very day. What we're going to do, however, is we're going to look at it from the standpoint that if God really is all in all, if God really is inclusive, then would he not be found in the sciences, in education, in philosophy, in all aspects of our thinking? And what we will show is that the biblical narrative and the teachings of Jesus, Moses, the prophets, the apostolic writers have all been pointing to this same spiral, except that they're using language that has to do with our image of God, our spiritual consciousness. So, what is the purpose of the series? What are some of the things that you can expect if you go ahead and go with us on this journey through this series? First of all, we hope that this will be for you what it is for us, and that is simply a tool to be used. Spiral dynamics in and of itself is not something where we're trying to say, hey everyone, you know how we used to believe this or that about the biblical narrative? Well, we now are going to bring it into this world of philosophy called spiral dynamics, and that's the only way to look at the narrative. No. Rather, we are saying that spiral dynamics is just a tool. Some of the questions that you may have asked yourself, and I'm going to say you have if you've been on this journey for very long at all, and you're looking at things through an inclusive lens. Some of the questions you might be asked or have asked of you is this. Look, Doug, if the Bible is really saying what you're saying about Jesus, about his work, about the coming of the kingdom, about the fulfillment of all things, and that God is an all-in-all inclusive God today, why haven't scholars, brilliant men who have studied the Bible for the last 2,000 years, why haven't they seen this? Has anyone ever asked you that? Why hasn't someone seen this? Well, the spiral dynamic study that we're going to do is going to make it very clear why no one has seen these things until this point in our history at the beginning of the third millennium. And even further than that, we're going to see that people could not have seen it and that it's okay. And furthermore, that it gives to us a future that is absolutely positive, vibrant, hopeful, dynamic, and therefore it's going to help us to continue to grow or evolve in our spiritual consciousness. Or perhaps you have had studies with people, and during the course of those studies, you have explained things that appear picture clear to you, only to have people just not be able to see it. And you have conversations with other people who do see it, and you say, how can someone not see this? It's so plain, it's so obvious. I'm so frustrated because I'm trying to explain this to people, but they just don't get it. As we study this spiral dynamic approach, we will have a better understanding of why people see or don't see something. We will really appreciate what Jesus said to the followers in the first century, that having ears you don't hear because they couldn't, and having eyes you don't see because they couldn't. And we'll understand what Jesus was up against and what he meant by that. And the big topic that we will talk about in integral theology is the topic of Christianity, the church, and Jesus. A lot of writings are happening now that have to do with addressing the church as emerging, the church as becoming more integral, the church as becoming more inclusive. And what we're going to look at is that church and Christianity were never to be the end result of the teachings of Jesus Christ regarding the coming of the kingdom of God. And that in fact, the teachings of the last 2,000 years, which have extended the purpose of the church from a messianic into an institutional religion called Christianity, are actually at the heart of so many problems historically, and they will remain at the heart of problems as we go forward until we see how that framework for seeing, interpreting, and understanding the church has to be reframed. So, what we'll do finally is we'll look at, well, what does this mean for all my relationships? At the end of the day, presence is always about relationships. And everything that we do, say, and study will be to enrich our personal relationships. Relationships with our spouses, with our children, our grandchildren, with our neighbors, with our co-workers. In fact, all of this will eventually leaven its way out into the global family of humanity. So, I thank you very much for your interest in this series on integral theology and spiral dynamics. And we will now move to our first opening slides on this study. And I will welcome your feedback, questions, and any other communication that you would like to offer us as we go through this particular study. So thank you for joining us. And let's begin now our study of the biblical narrative and spiral dynamics.
So as we can see here, looking at the first slide that we have, or the first chart, we're taking a look at the chart on spiral dynamics itself. And you can see that it's divided up into different levels. Now, if you go to the Presence.tv website, Tim is already writing and contributing articles under the tab called Integral Theory. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to explain the technicalities of the spiral. The reason I'm going to go through these quickly in this first session is just to set the groundwork and make sure for everyone that you're understanding what spiral dynamics is, how it works, and then it will make so much more sense as we overlay the biblical narrative to this. There are a variety of ways that we can label the spiral, and I'm going to go through a handful of ways that we can label the spiral, but all of them are to help us see how the understanding or viewpoint of the human race started out in a very basic consciousness level, and then over the centuries and now millennia, they've developed into more and more deeper levels of thinking. I started by using the spiral as color only and no other labels on here, just to say that oftentimes people will use color as a term for a level so that we don't start thinking about one level being superior to another. Because in terms of value, every person on the planet, from Adam all the way to the 6.5 billion or so of us that are on the planet now, have all been created in the image of God. So it's not that we have a different value or have ever had a different value. The reason I'm starting off with this being labeled as a first-tier lens or a second-tier lens is simply to point out that these are different ways or levels of seeing things. So in this case, I might say that if I see this a particular way, that it's because the lens that I look through is really pretty much a red lens or an orange lens or a yellow lens. And that doesn't mean that I'm superior or inferior to other people that I'm having a discussion with. It's simply helping me to understand that I have a particular viewpoint. So in looking at this, instead of viewing the spiral as a hierarchy, showing that there are some of us on the planet that are superior to others, it's really a case of looking at what lens we look through. All of us realize that this changes through life. We start into the world on very basic consciousness level, but we don't criticize the fact that we had to begin with our childhood. And in fact, that's exactly the example that Paul uses when he writes. He says, there was a time I was a child. I spoke as a child, thought as a child. Why? Because that was the context for where he was in life at that time. Now, there does come a time when you move to different concepts and different levels of consciousness, and we'll talk about that as we get into the spiral, obviously, in a lot more detail. But looking at this, you can see then that if we use colors, we're basically saying, oh, Doug, I see, you are really looking at this through a blue lens, and that makes a lot of sense because your background of what you understand comes from here, and it's not to condemn you for what you believe or to tell everyone else, and you should think exactly like Doug because he sees everything the correct way. It's simply helping us to recognize the way that understanding evolves in human beings. And then again, we're going to take this and we're going to say, and so then how did God evolve spiritual consciousness? So we have the colors, and if you'll notice, there is a first-tier lens, and those colors all pertain to what we're going to be talking about as first-tier, and then there is a second-tier lens. Now, again, what these two tiers signify are the place in time where there is what we might call an evolutionary leap, or what we might call a significant change that has something about it that's different from moving from, say, beige to purple or purple to red. There's something that happens when you move from the green at the top of first-tier lens all the way on up to yellow. There's significant change that's happening in our thought processes here. And we'll talk about what integral consciousness is and what spiral dynamics sees as it looks through these different lenses at the particular evolutionary growth with humanity moving forward from the beginning of time as we've been able to study humanity in history. And again, we're going to move from the study of cultures in history to the study of the biblical narrative and the way that God has evolved our spiritual consciousness. So let's take a look at the next chart then. So looking at this next diagram, it's labeled a little bit differently. In spiral dynamics, when they're studying the history of human cultures, what they found in their studies is that all humanity really began on an archaic level. And most of us are well aware of these levels to a large degree because it's what we've studied in history, and there's nothing really here that's too surprising, except maybe in the uppermost levels, which are really just coming to light within the academic study of spiral dynamics. But looking at this, humanity, of course, starts at a very archaic level where we're operating on our basic survival instincts, if you will. And as humanity develops, certainly the first social, cultural study would begin with the tribal, which is really a family level, and all that goes with the tribal thinking. And then as the tribes grew and my tribe came into conflict or came into contact with your tribe, there would be conflict, and that would lead to a warrior level of humanity where we know that we have Genghis Khan and Vikings, and we have all kinds of things that are warring against each other so that my tribe can be protected and not harmed by your tribe. Then we move into the traditional level, and traditional would be a development of law where we now have governments that are taking on more and more importance, and we will see this in the governments of Babylonia or the government of the Greeks, followed by the Romans, and those kinds of things. And the traditional level is really about boundaries and law and order. And then we move to modern, which really, in the modern, as spiral dynamics studies that, you're looking at about 500 years ago, and the modern age will show is the age where we're getting into science and technologies just beginning, although on a very basic level 500 years ago, and then also what's happening in religious thought as well in the modern age. Then the postmodern is a fairly recent segment of thinking. We'll talk about what postmodern thinking is, and then we'll talk about integral, as you see in yellow, and then post-integral. Now, one of the things, again, I want to emphasize here is that none of these levels is meant to be a condemnation of all the other levels. In fact, that is an attribute, if you will, of the higher second-tier lens, and that is its ability to see that all of the levels that came before it are actually a necessary context for where you end up with a more integral viewpoint, if you will. Now, if you're an archaic tribal warrior and you're in that kind of a mindset, you believe that that is the only viewpoint. And in fact, you have great conflict with anyone who's looking through a different lens. It's not until you get on up past postmodern into integral thinking and post-integral thinking that you can actually look back on all the levels and say, all of these are necessary. And in fact, all of us on the planet today are passing through all these levels, or have passed through most of the levels, and are entering into levels that could only be attained because we first experienced the other levels. And when we begin to notice that or realize that, we'll begin to see that all of life is really just a story of context. In other words, I'm not looking at my past as something that was a problem or a failure. Oh, I can't believe I did this. Oh, I had all of these problems. That's not to say that we didn't either incur pain or inflict pain on other people. It's not to say that we don't look at things in our past and realize now that we would handle particular situations in a completely different way. But it is to say is that as we grow on this planet in human consciousness, and we grow through these various levels, that we bring better solutions to the problems. The same problems may present themselves, but when we apply different levels of thinking to those problems, we come up with solutions that are far more likely to lead to peace and reconciliation than they would to lead to war. So, having looked at that, let's now make application of this and pull it a little bit more into the biblical narrative. So, looking at this chart or diagram, we're now going to detail the spiral out just a bit more and begin to overlay the biblical narrative with the spiral. Again, there's plenty of books that we can study about spiral dynamics and how spiral dynamics is being used to consult in the field of politics, in the field of education, in business. Really, spiral dynamics and understanding the viewpoint of other people on the planet is an extremely beneficial and useful study because it helps us see how other people think, and it helps us communicate more clearly so that we're not just talking past each other. It's just like if you are looking through a different color lens, you would be speaking a different language. And you can't communicate with someone if you don't know how to speak their language. That doesn't mean that you'll agree with everything that the other person says or they'll agree with you, but it does mean that the first step in communication is we have to realize where everyone's coming from. So in looking at that, as God developed humanity, there was a reason why God didn't come to Adam and Eve in the garden and sit them down and say, listen, I want to explain to you today that I'm all in all, and I want you to understand what it means to have integral consciousness, Adam and Eve. No, the biblical narrative knows that God could no more sit down and explain to Adam and Eve all of the concepts of integral and post-integral at the top of our spiral dynamic chart than I could sit down with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and say, I want to tell you all of the things I've experienced and that I know in living on the planet Earth for these 59 years. And that way, you'll already know this, and you won't have to go through some of the experiences that I went through where I had to learn from painful things. Well, you can't do that. But you can understand the thinking that everyone has as they do evolve. And I use the word evolve or evolution in the sense of growth. I know that with some people, the word evolution may cause some concern. And I'm not here to talk about all the different views of evolution and the way you look at that, except to say that Paul, again, himself realized that life is about an evolution of growth from childhood to adulthood. And so, in that sense, we're certainly talking about the ability for us all to grow. And when God starts with archaic Adam, and we are going to take each one of these levels apart in future presentations as we post them to the website, and we're going to look at them in great detail. God starts with archaic Adam, and God's going to have some initial steps that really contribute to just the beginning of spiritual consciousness, that which makes a human being different from all other life on the planet Earth. The fact that we have a spiritual consciousness. This is the story of the narrative. But the narrative is also going to show that spiritual consciousness has to grow, and it has to grow in a step-by-step level. In other words, yes, there was Adam, but after Adam, God could not introduce directly Moses and law, which is going to come in the traditional level, but rather God had to go to Abraham on the tribal level. And in fact, the first covenant or agreement that God makes is going to be with Abraham regarding the problems and the unworkable situation that Adam incurred. And God is going to give promises to Abraham that say, Abraham, there are certain things that you are going to experience here at this tribal level. But embedded within your particular experiences are not only what you yourself and your tribe will do and experience with me as your God, but you will also be carrying with you the promise of future levels of understanding that are going to continue to evolve and grow the spiritual consciousness of all my children on the planet, the many nations, all the nations. And this thinking, this consciousness, provides a positive impetus for the future Abraham, because reconciliation of all the nations is going to be the topic of the biblical narrative. And that means that the evolutionary activity of the one that all religions point to as the creator, the God of all the universe, is an activity that's based on positive, optimistic reconciliation, even though it may not at the time appear to be that way. So, for example, when early Israel moves out of Egypt and is in her warrior stage, her idea of serving God and being one with God is to defeat all the other nations. And then, of course, late Israel is going to develop and have a far more detailed view of how to obey God under law and order, and we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about what modern religion came to find out as about 500 years ago, followed, of course, by postmodern. And we'll talk about all the attributes of postmodern religion as it applies to today, and what the viewpoint of postmodern religions would be. And then, of course, lastly, we're going to talk about the second-tier understanding viewpoint lens of what would be called integral or post-integral thought. How is that different from all of the first-tier levels? And what does that mean to spiritual consciousness? What is it that we're now beginning to see in the way we interpret the narrative and the way we see the narrative as a far more inclusive concept, far more than any of the first-tier lenses? So, as we look at that, we've got this basically broke down into these various tiers, and this is the way the narrative will be laid out as we go into it. Now, to take a look at this in a little bit more detail and to explain this in perhaps a little bit different way, or to expand on this, let's take a look at another slide here that's going to give us a different way of looking at the same thing. Here we have a slide on spiral dynamics that, as you note, instead of me putting first tier lens or second tier lens, I put flesh and spirit. And that's because when we study integral theology is integral God. Integral theology is that God is all in all and yet above all. When we study this, those levels or viewpoints that start with archaic Adam and go all the way through postmodern are going to be viewpoints that correspond to the biblical teaching of the apostolic writers and of Jesus on the concept of the flesh and what it would mean to be after the flesh. We'll see that all of the first tier lens thinking is a thinking that would lend itself to the apostolic concept of being after the flesh. And that when we get into integral and post-integral, we will see that the writers and teachers and Jesus himself was teaching about an integral concept that more accurately displays what it means to be after the Spirit. Now, as we look at this, we might use, for example, the concepts that are in the book of Galatians written by Paul, chapter 4, where many of you who are viewing this now and who have followed us at Presence know that Paul talks about in great detail the flesh and the spirit. And one of the main points we'll make here, and again, we're going to go back through all these levels and go into this in much more detail, but one of the basic principles to our understanding the biblical narrative as we see it relating to spiral dynamics is that the flesh would correlate to the self. Paul talks about the self, crucifying the self. The flesh would also correspond to the ego. And we're going to, again, talk about this in much more detail. And what that means is that all of the first-tier lenses and viewpoints really put the emphasis on the self as the source of relationship with God. Whereas as we move into the integral and post-integral look at spirit, we're going to see that God is the source of relationship, that it has nothing to do with what I do, but rather it has everything to do with what God did. And so as we look at spiral dynamics, we're going to see that these first levels of flesh are going to correspond, as even Paul uses it in his day, to all of that which comes from the self as source. And then Paul is going to explain that anything that comes from God as source is spirit. Now, of course, the next question is, well, what does that mean in my viewpoint? What does that mean in my thinking? If I went into any Christian service and went into one of their classes or study groups, and I brought up the concept of flesh and spirit, I don't think there would be anyone that would disagree with the concept of flesh and spirit in general. But when we start to look at, well, what exactly does that mean to you if you're looking through a blue lens and someone else is looking through an orange lens and someone else is looking through a green lens and I'm looking through a different color lens, is it possible that the way you look at the term flesh and spirit is significantly different than the way I look at the term flesh and spirit? And the answer is yes, of course, it has to be. And that's okay, because the only way that we learn and grow is to communicate with each other, look at the narrative over and over again, and understand it, hopefully, as an infinite way of growing in our spiritual consciousness. So, having looked at this, we know then that we will be using the spiral to show how God moves the human understanding from one where I, Doug, am the source of what needs to happen, and it's up to me to make sure that it happens, to understanding what it would mean for me, Doug, if I understood God to be the source of all things. How would that affect my relationships? What would that do for me in my relationship with my spouse, with my children, with my grandchildren, and so on and so forth? So that's the way we'll look at that. Now, let's take another look at spiral dynamics and see how it would apply as we end this session to another application. So the last slide I want to look at here, the last chart diagram, I'm putting an emphasis on that level or lens, the blue level, or the traditional level, because for those of us in integral theology that see God as all in all now and who have studied the narrative from the standpoint that everything in the narrative stands complete or fulfilled, and that there is nothing awaiting this planet Earth, such as the destruction of the earth, or that there's a future coming of Jesus that's going to be the time when God needs to make everything right, or to bring justice in one fell swoop through God injecting himself into human history, that we understand exactly from our point of view how the narrative is teaching that human consciousness and spiritual consciousness are to grow infinitely, and that it is not about some terminal place in time when everything, quote, comes to an end. And that means we're going to spend a considerable amount of time looking at this traditional blue level. Now, in this chart, I've widened it just a bit and relabeled it just a bit to make the following points. First of all, it's going to be in this traditional level that we find the concept of law and order and boundary as a very, very big part of this understanding. And once someone understands the law or the rules or the requirements, then there's a very strong desire to conform to those particular laws, rules, or requirements. And if anything threatens that viewpoint, then in many cases we will experience a drop down to warrior thinking, because we will immediately see ourselves in a position where we need to defend this particular viewpoint. In my younger days, in my 20s, I was especially seeing things in the blue lens and ready to go warrior on someone in a debate style, an argument style, or in a judgment or condemnation way, in order to protect what I felt like was what God wanted, which was my understanding of what God wanted under a blue lens. Now again, this is simply to say that I would not be contemplating what I believe to be in the yellow or turquoise inclusive integral type thinking principles of an all-in-all God today if I had not first experienced the blue traditional lens. It was absolutely essential for my particular spiritual consciousness to grow to this point. Now, for people who look through a blue lens today, they would probably say that I didn't grow or evolve into an inclusive view, but rather I stepped outside the boundaries of what God has outlined very clearly as acceptable versus unacceptable. And of course, in church history, one of the most famous words for this would be heresy. That you believe something that is heresy. Why? Because it does not fit within the bounds of what we would see in a blue lens as that which is acceptable to God. Now, why do people have a blue lens or an orange or a green or whatever? Is it because people in the blue who are part of a law-based or requirement-based viewpoint are bad people? No, not at all. Not at all. What it means is that is to them the way that one is to please God. It is a sincere desire to do what they feel God wants them to do. And anyone who's not doing this, they have to feel that that person is in danger in some way or another, and that person needs to be changed or converted, or perhaps they will go to a hell. They will be castigated outside the realms of what is now known as church or their religion. So before we move into the next session, and I'm going to wrap it up here, I'm trying to keep these to around 35-40 minutes, and before we move into our next session, let me just wrap this up by simply saying that it will be within this traditional blue level that we'll take a good look, because it will be late Israel, the Israel that we find in first century times that Jesus came to, and then early Christianity that's going to begin in this blue level. And the exciting thing about spiral dynamics to me is this. We're going to look at, why did Jesus come when he did? What is it that shows that Jesus' work, Jesus of Nazareth, was a messenger for an above all God, not just an all in all God, but an above all God? What would that mean, that he was a messenger for above all God? And why is it that in that time, in the first century, that everything was taken and turned into an institution that still exists out here today? Israel and Judaism still exists out here today. What possible way could we understand spiral dynamics to see how we could move beyond religion? Is that even possible? So we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to see in detail exactly why the biblical narrative of the first century with Jesus and the apostolic writers had to take place at that time in order for the spiral to continue to grow and evolve spiritual consciousness. That in fact Jesus could not have come at any other time in history than the exact time he came. And having understood that, we're going to be able to understand a lot more about how we can communicate with other people who have viewpoints or lenses that are of a different color than ours, how we can contribute in this world, how we can be a positive force in this world to help other people in their spiritual walk and their spiritual growth. So we'll end here for now. Thanks for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our next session.